One of the reasons I'm a big fan of yours is you're a student of history. And so you've recommended a bunch of books to me. And they and others thread the different movements throughout American history. Some movements take off and do hold power for a long time, some don't. And some are started by a small number of people and are controlled by a small number of people. Some are mass movements. And it's just fascinating to watch how those movements evolve and then fit themselves maybe into the constraints of a two-party system.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to sort of talk about the various perspectives of that. So would it be fair to say that this election was turned into a kind of class struggle?
Well, I won't go that far because to say it's a class struggle really implies that things fundamentally align on economic lines, and I don't think that's necessarily accurate. Although, if that's your lens, you could get there. So there's a very big statistic going around right now where Kamala Harris increased her vote share in one households over $100,000 or more, and Donald Trump won households under 100,000. So you could view that in an economic lens. The problem, again, that I have is that is much more a proxy for four-year college degree and for education. And so one of my favorite books is called Coming Apart by Charles Murray. And that book really underscores how the cultural milieu that people swim in when they attend a four-year college degree and the trajectory of their life, not only on where they move to, who they marry, what type of grocery store they go to, their cultural, what television shows that they watch. One of my favorite questions from Charles Murray is called a bubble quiz. I encourage people to go take it, by the way, which it asks you a question. It's like, what does the word Branson mean to you? And it has a couple of answers. One of them is Branson is Richard Branson, Sir Richard Branson. Number two is Branson, Missouri, which is like a country music tourist style destination. Three is it means nothing. So you are less in a bubble if you say country music, and you're very much in the bubble if you say Richard Branson. And I remember taking that test for the first time. I go, obviously, Sir Richard Branson, Virgin Atlantic. Like, what? And then I was like, wait, I'm in the bubble. And there are other things in there, like, can you name various different military ranks? I can because I'm a history nerd, but the vast majority of college-educated people don't know anybody who served in the United States military. They don't have family members who do. The most popular shows in America are like The Big Bang Theory and NCIS, whereas people in our probably cultural milieu, our favorite shows are White Lotus, The Last of Us. This is prestige television, right? With a very small audience, but high income, high education. So the point is that culture really defines who we are as Americans, where we live. And rural, urban is one way to describe it, but honestly, with the work from home revolution and more rich people and highly educated people moving to more rural, suburban, or areas they traditionally weren't able to commute in, that's changing. And so really, the internet is everything. The stuff that you consume on the internet, the stuff that you spend your time doing, type of books you read, whether you read a book at all, frankly, whether you travel to Europe, whether you have a passport, all the things that you value in your life, that is the real cultural divide in America. And I actually think that's what this revolution of Donald Trump was activating and bringing people to the polls, bringing a lot of those traditional working class voters of all races away from the Democratic Party along the lines of elitism, of sneering, and of a general cultural feeling that these people don't understand me and my struggles in this life.
And so the trivial formulation is the wokeism, the anti-wokeism movement.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that Trump winning was a statement against wokeism. It was the broader anti-elitism.
It's difficult to say because I wouldn't dismiss anti-wokeism or wokeism as an explanation, but we need to understand like the electoral impacts of woke. So there's varying degrees of like how you're going to encounter quote unquote wokeism, and this is a very difficult thing to define. So let me just try and break it down, which is there are the types of things that you're going to interact with on a cultural basis, and what I mean by that is going to watch a TV show and just for some reason there's like two trans characters. And it's never like particularly explained why, they just are there. Or watching a commercial and it's the same thing. Watching, I don't know, I remember was watching, I think it was Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And it was a terrible movie, by the way, don't recommend it. But one of the characters, I think her name was like America, and she wore a gay pride flag, right? Look, many left-wingers would make fun of me for saying these things, but that is obviously a social agenda to the point as in they believe it is like deeply acceptable, that is used by Hollywood and cultural elites who really value those progress, in sexual orientation and others. And they really believe it's important to quote unquote showcase it for representation. So that's like one way that we may encounter quote unquote wokeism. But the more important ways, frankly, are the ways that affirmative action, which really has its roots in, American society all the way going back to the 1960s, and how those have manifested in our economy and in our understanding of quote unquote discrimination. So two books I can recommend. One is called The Origins of Woke. That's by Richard Hanania. There's another one by The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. And they make a very strong case that Caldwell in particular, that he calls it like a new founding of America, was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because it created an entire new legal regime and understanding of race in the American character and how the government was going to enforce that. And that really ties in with another one of the books that I recommended to you about the origins of Trump by Jim Webb. And Senator Jim Webb, incredible, incredible man. He's so underappreciated, intellectual. He was anti-war, and people may remember him from the 2016 primary, and they asked him, I had asked him a question, I don't exactly remember, about one of his enemies, and he's like, well, one of them was a guy I shot in Vietnam, and he was running against Hillary. And that guy, he wrote the book, Born Fighting, I think what's History of the Scots-Irish People, something like that. And that book really opened my eyes to the way that affirmative action and racial preferences that were playing out, through the HR managerial elite really turned a lot of people within the white working class away from the Democratic Party and felt fundamentally discriminated against by the professional managerial class. And so there's a lot of roots to this, the Managerial Revolution by James Burnham, and in terms of the origin of kind of how we got here, but the crystallization of like DEI and or affirmative action, I prefer to use the term affirmative action, in the highest echelons of business. And there became this idea that representation itself was the only thing that mattered. And I think that right around 2014, that really went on steroids. And that's why it's not an accident that Donald J. Trump elected in 2016.
At this point, do you think this election is a kind of statement that wokeism as a movement is dead?
I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to say because wokeism itself is not a movement with a party leader. It's a amorphous belief that has worked its way through institutions now for almost 40 or 50 years. I mean, it's effectively a religion. And part of the reason why it's difficult to define is it means different things to different people. So, for example, there are varying degrees of how we would define quote unquote woke. Do I think that the Democrats will be speaking in so-called academic language? Yes, I do think they will. I think that the next Democratic nominee will not do that. However, Kamala Harris actually did move as much as she could away from quote unquote woke, but she basically was punished for a lot of the sins of both herself from 2019, but a general cultural feeling that her and the people around her do not understand me, and not only do not understand me, but have racial preferences or a regime or an understanding that would lead to a quote unquote equity mindset, equal outcomes for everybody as opposed to equality of opportunity, which is more of a colorblind philosophy. So I can't say. I think it's way too early. And, again, like you can not use the word Latinx, but do you still believe in an effective affirmative action regime, in terms of how you would run your Department of Justice, in terms of how you view the world, in terms of what you think the real dividing lines in America are? Because I would say that's still actually kind of a woke mindset. And that's part of the reason why the term itself doesn't really mean a whole lot. And we have to get actually really specific about what it looks like in operations. In operation, it means affirmative action. It means the NASDAQ passing some law that if you want to go public or something, that you have to have a woman and a person of color on your board. Like this is a blatant and extraordinary racialism that they've enshrined in their bylaws. So you can get rid of ESG, that's great. But you can get rid of DEI, I think that's great. But it's really about a mindset and a view of the world, and I don't think that's going anywhere.
And you think the reason it doesn't work well in practice is because there's a big degree to which it's anti-meritocracy.
It's anti-American, really. I mean, DEI and woke and affirmative action make perfect sense in a lot of different countries. Okay, and there are a lot of countries out there that are multi-ethnic and they're heterogeneous, and they are run by basically quasi-dictators. And the way it works is that you pay off the Christians and you pay off the Muslims, and they get this guy and they get that guy, and everybody kind of shakes it. It's very explicit. Where they're like, we have 10 spots, and they go to the Christians. We have 10 spots, and they goes to the Hindus. I'm talking India is a country that I know pretty well, and this does kind of work like that on state politics level in some respect. But in America, fundamentally, we really believe that no matter where you are from, that you come here and basically within a generation, especially if you migrate here legally and you integrate, that you leave a lot of that stuff behind. And the story, the American dream that is ingrained in so many of us is one that really does not mesh well with any sort of racial preference regime or anything that's not meritocratic. And I will give the left wingers some, credit in the idea that meritocracy itself, could have preference for people who have privileged backgrounds. I think that's true. And so, the way I would like to see it is to increase everybody's equality of opportunity to make sure that they all have a chance at quote unquote willing out the American dream, but that doesn't erase meritocracy, hard work, and many of the other things that we associate with the American character, with the American frontier. So really, these are two ideologies which are really at odds. Like in a lot of ways, like wokeism, racialism, and all this is a third world ideology. It's one that's very prevalent in Europe and all across Asia, but it doesn't mix well here, and it shouldn't. And I'm really glad that America feels the same way.